Welcome to this week's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Thank you very, very much for joining us today in what I promise you will be a very interesting and exciting conversation. And to that end, let me immediately welcome our guest today, Dr. Michael Meyer, a professor at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio, my alma mater and location. Dr. Meyer is back with us. A while ago, we were honored to have him discuss his book on Leo Baeck, and we are doubly honored to have him back today to talk about his brand new book published by the CCR Press called Above All, We Are Jews, a biography of Rabbi Alexander M. Schindler. The book looks like this. To my colleagues out there, especially colleagues of my generation or a little bit younger, this is a must read. You will run through it. You will find it fascinating, entertaining, educational, and enlightening. Dr. Meyer, thank you very, very much for joining us. I really am very, very grateful, and congratulations on this book. It's great.
Thank you.
To use a very New Jerseyan phrase, it's great. And full disclosure to the people who don't know me, Dr. Meyer, I served for 30-some years on the staff of what was then UHC, but then became the Union for Reform Judaism as a regional director, and then my Department of Jewish Family Concerns during the tenure of Rabbi Alexander Schindler as the president of the Union. So I have a vested interest in this book. I know a lot of these people in this book in many, many different ways. So it was fascinating to read basically decades of my own life of, working. So I remember that speech, or I remember at a meeting, or I remember this. It's just great. So thank you very, very much. Thank you. Let's talk about the book. So I guess the first question, Dr. Meyer, is what drew you to write a bio of Alex, and why now at this time?
Well, there were a number of factors that entered into my decision to undertake this task for the last 3 years or so. First of all, I recognized that in Alexander Schindler, we had perhaps the most important leader of American Reform Judaism in the 20th century. And no one had written a comprehensive biography of this important individual. Secondly, the American Jewish Archives, located here in Cincinnati, fortunately was the recipient of Alexander Schindler's papers, so that I had extensive files that helped me in writing the history of his life, not simply published items, but correspondence that had hardly been seen by the public. And in addition to that, I would say it's that I felt the time had come where we needed a figure like Alexander Schindler in our movement, and that maybe by knowing more about him, that might inspire our movement to reach higher and to be yet more successful. So these were the reasons that led me to write the biography, to which perhaps I should add that I knew him personally. I met him for the first time when I was in a summer camp at Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, and he was the dean at that, what was then UAHC camp. So for all these reasons, I was drawn to it. I had done, as you mentioned, a biography of Leo Baeck, perhaps one of the most important leaders of German Jewry, especially during the Nazi period. And now I wanted to concentrate on someone who was of likewise great importance in American Reform Judaism.
When you were with Alex at Oconomowoc, did you play tennis with him?
I played tennis with him later. I think I even mentioned in passing in the book that his partner in life, Ria, was also his partner in tennis. And she was in the backfield running all around, which Alex was not good at doing. He was a little bit overweight, but he was at the net and he was deadly there. So no, I didn't play with him in those early days, but I did get him to lend me his convertible to go out with the girl I had just met while the camp session was going on.
He used to come to, when I was our regional camp, Camp Harlem. And when I remember what in the staff meeting, my closest friend on the staff of Larry Jakowski of blessed memory, my brother, we one day were at a staff meeting. I think it was, I don't know where it was, it doesn't matter. Alex and Rhea said, well, we want to play. Why don't you two play? And we wound up winning like 2 or 3 points. And Rhea hit a ball that went to the back. And Jake and I go over there, and I lean over and says, Jake, we're winning. And he said, but it's probably not a good idea if we want to keep our jobs. So many, many memories. You write extensively in the beginning of the book. It's fascinating because I never knew any of this about his family of origin, especially his mom, and as well as Eliezer. Could you talk a little bit about as you walk through all these correspondence and the papers and everything? He carried that family of origin stuff here, didn't he? That was very important to him.
It was very important to him. Now, he had a mixed origin. On the one hand, he was born in Munich, Germany. He spent the first 12 years of his life in Munich before migrating to the United States. But he was conscious in a very lively way of his East European background. His father, Eliezer, whom you mentioned, was a Yiddish poet. And Alex Schindler really, I think, saw himself far more as an East European Jew, as a Jew of a Galician background than a Jew of the German tradition. He loved to use expressions in Yiddish. He was very much influenced by Hasidism. He avoided use of the German language, avoided trips to Germany as much as possible, so that made him a figure in Reform Judaism that represented a newer generation. The older generation of American Reform Judaism was very much influenced by the German tradition, by German Jewish thinkers. But for Alexander Schindler, there was something lost in that tradition, namely the emotional element in Judaism. He was attracted to mysticism, not in the technical sense of Kabbalah, but in the sense of a relationship to God, which was based no less upon feeling than it was upon reason. He loved to quote the phrase that one in Judaism tried to go from kavana to dveikus. I purposely use the Ashkenazi pronunciation, namely from religious awareness and concentration to a clinging to God. In other words, not a rational relationship to God, not believing in God out of any particular argument, but rather a belief in God that came out of the soul more than it did out of the mind.
I think, as for those of you who will read the book, and you should, can't tell you what to do, but I recommend it. And in taking a look now historically, I would say it's safe to say that Schindler was a very transitional figure in American Judaism. I say that because I was ordained in 1972. He had just become he was about to become I forget, at the biennial in New York when Eisendrath passed away. And it was during the rabbinate of my generation, under his leadership, that all these revolutions took place, that the cleaving, the interfaith relationship, the revolution, the LGBT revolution, the spirituality revolution, the music revolution, the feminist revolution. Sally was in my class. All of this, as you read the book, he favored. At the same time, as you say, part of his, one foot was back in Eastern Europe. So is it safe to say that he now historically could be seen as the transitional figure in American liberal Judaism?
Well, in part, he was that figure. In part, he was the result of that transition. What I find particularly interesting, Rabbi Andrus, is that not in all of these areas was he without ambivalence.
Right.
In the book, I write about his relationship to gay rights, for example. And he talks about the fact that initially he was very much under the impression that the theory that homosexuality, the term used at that time, was a disease, was the correct way to understand it, as many psychiatrists at that time did understand it. And it was only through an inner struggle that he was able to come to the opinion that gay and queer people should be regarded not as suffering from a disease, but should be suffering as possessing a sexual identity which was as valid as any other.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to, because in reading the book, it's fascinating, again, to see this, whether the word struggle is the right word for him. You write extensively about, in the chapter on the outreach program, about his, I think you used the word ambivalence sometime, about rabbis who officiated intermarriage. He wouldn't do so at his own child's. The struggles, but at the same time, the movement, he was the figure that was leading a lot of these revolutions. And yet you had this picture of a very complex, but practical person with internal contradictions, yet with a vision. And that's why I think in reading the book, you just get so much of an appreciation of this man.
Well, what I think you see is that he wasn't a hidebound ideologue in any way. That, as you said, he struggled with these issues. And with regard to the matter of outreach, for which he is, after all, best known, he certainly was a proponent of it. He was a proponent of it from the time he was very young, because his father was a proponent of inreach and of missionizing. He sometimes said, if you don't have a mission, you don't have a message. So he certainly wanted the non-Jewish partner in an interfaith marriage to feel at home. But he also recognized that if the individual felt entirely at home in the congregation, and if the rabbi had officiated at that interfaith marriage, there was the possibility that Jews would be lost, if not in that generation, in the next generation. He called that the sting that comes along with the honey being the freedom that Jews enjoy in American society to mingle easily with non-Jews in universities and other settings, but the result was a diminution of the Jewish people in the future, and that concerned him particularly as a refugee from the Holocaust. Alexander Schindler had a profound consciousness of the Holocaust and its effect throughout his entire life. I mention in the book that he wrote his bachelor's thesis at CCNY on the question of the Nazis and the Jews as reflected in the Nuremberg trials after the war. He was concerned about the fact that the number of Jews was being diminished as a result of the honey, the open atmosphere in which Jews lived. I mention in the book that at one point he even considered having 6 children, one for each of the million Jews who had been killed in the Holocaust. As it turned out, he ended up with only 5 children, not quite 6, including a pair of fraternal twins. So there was the ambivalence. On the one hand, he wanted the congregations to be welcome. He wanted that non-Jews, either who were part of an interfaith marriage or who were not part of an interfaith marriage, to recognize that Judaism had a message that was not to be found in secularism or in other faiths. He wanted it to welcome them, to encourage them, but as he added, he wanted the rabbi to suggest to such individuals who were married to Jews but were non-Jews, he wanted rabbis to say, won't you now want to take the next step and undergo a complete conversion? Because in conversionary marriages, the chances of the children being raised in Judaism were greater than in the case of an interfaith marriage.
During, and even now, but especially during Alex's time, when you would go to the biennials, you would go to meetings, and the word coming down was, we're booming, we have more congregations, people are joining, this is the wave of the future. Interesting enough, in the book, you really pulled the curtain back on some of the internal challenges, financially, population-wise, demographically, that things were not always as rosy as the speeches from the dais at the biennials or the meetings were. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, there were, of course, financial ups and downs, depending largely on what the stock market was doing in the United States and how donations were coming in. But I think that Alexander Schindler was a person who was fundamentally optimistic. And you have to remember that during the time that he was the president of the Union, the Reform movement had become or was becoming the most populous of the American Jewish denominations, which had not been the case in the time of his predecessor, Maurice Eisendrath, when conservative Judaism was the most populous. But during Alex's time, the Reform movement was growing. The number of congregations was growing. And yes, there were financial straits from time to time, but it was a much larger operation than it had been in Eisendrath's time, and considerably larger than today. In Schindler's time, one had regions, as you know very well, Rabbi Address, I think 14 of them at one time. You had regional conferences of rabbis and of laity. You had a quarterly journal called Reform Judaism, which came into every Reform household. You had a very active youth movement called at that time NIFTY, which had regional representations as well. There was every reason, I would say, to be optimistic during those years from 1973, when he first became president, until he retired from the presidency 12 years later in 1995.
One of the things that we remember about Alex Schindler is his ability to hold 5,000 to 6,000 people in the State of the Union, as we used to call it, speech at the biennial, or even in a meeting, or at a sermon at a synagogue when he would come and speak at a synagogue. You write that this idea of the sermon was to be a skillfully crafted oratory with humor, verve, and content elevated by emotional crescendo, which is a great line. What's happened to that?
Well, let me say, first of all, that he was a master of oratory, a very different kind of oratory from that of his predecessor. Boris Eisendrath had been very alliterative and very dramatic in his State of the Union addresses. I was quite young, but I attended at least one of those. Schindler's had a poetic soul, and his sermons, therefore, had a poetic quality to them. He was very careful and talented with regard to the figures of speech that he used, so that his States of the Union addresses were always the highlight of biennial conferences, which during his time drew as many as 5,000 participants. But with regard to the question of the sermon generally, I share with many of the people of my and your age group great sorrow that the sermon in the local congregation is no longer what it once was. It lacks that inspirational quality, to say nothing of any sense of rebuke for moral failings on the part of members of the congregation. Instead, one has a situation, and I have sought developing over the years when I listened to student sermons here at Hebrew Union College, more and more the sermons began to focus on my life, not my message, so much as my life. Here's what I learned and what you can learn from me. Leo Beck, as I think I mentioned when we spoke about him, took pride in the fact that he never used the personal pronoun I in his sermons at all, at least not in his first congregation. In sermons today, the word I is omnipresent, and I think a great deal is lost on that account. We have much lower attendance at religious services in the Reform movement than we used to have. In part, that is true to the decline of liberal Judaism and liberal religion in general, I would say, within this country in the last decades. But Schindler, as I said, was optimistic, and he had a great hope that what would follow after him would continue the upward curve that he was able to encourage and propagate in his own time.
You write in the book, and again, we're speaking with Dr. Michael Meyer, the author of a brand new CCAR Press biography, Above All We Are Jews, a biography of Rabbi Alexander Schindler, a must-read for many of us. You write is a section in the book talking about politics and social justice issues, and also the issues around Black-Jewish relations during Alex's tenure, which were, again, not one-dimensional, very complex. And I remember a board meeting, actually, at one of the fancy hotels in West Palm Beach, where he invited Jesse Jackson to speak to the URJ board, which was an interesting conversation in its own right. Talk to me a little bit about his journey with Black-Jewish relationships during his tenure.
Well, first, with regard to Andrew Young had been appointed to political office by Jimmy Carter, and he had met with the representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization at the UN, which was against American policy. And not long after that, Carter had fired him. And the Jews were blamed for that, although the Jews were not responsible for it. Schindler was not in favor of an American diplomat meeting with a representative of the PLO, because we have to remember that at that time, the PLO did not recognize the existence of the State of Israel. As for Jesse Jackson had made some remarks that could be regarded as anti-Semitic. Schindler obviously could not accept the anti-Semitic attitudes that these two men had given voice to. However, one of Schindler's basic qualities was his tendency to forgive. He did not believe that someone like a Jesse Jackson or a Andrew Young could not be made to look upon the Jews more favorably and be more conscious of their concern for the State of Israel as a part of their Jewish identity. This quality of forgiveness, I should mention, meant also that he was ready to forgive rabbis if they engaged in acts that were not on the highest moral level. Teshuvah, repentance, was a quality that for Schindler was very central to Judaism, and it applied to both Jews and non-Jews, both whites and blacks.
Yeah, you write about this in the book, and is very real. Again, looking back and having lived through some of that with him and on members of the staff, the whole social justice political platform. Where would Alex stand today on some of this? He was an immigrant, and you write about and you just mentioned that one foot still in the old country in Eastern Europe. What do you think his take would be on this anti-immigrant stance that we seem to have so much of today?
I mean, we have to remember that Alex was himself an immigrant, that he was a refugee from a situation which was dangerous to his life. As immigrants coming from Latin America today, for the most part, are people who are running from danger to themselves and their families. I can't imagine that Schindler today would favor a policy that was inimical to refugees. So I think he very definitely would have been on the side that favors mercifulness as opposed to exclusion. With regard to the State of Israel, he was also very much of a liberal who, in a statement which I found really quite astounding, relatively late in his career, expressed feeling for what the Palestinians have suffered and compared them to the Jews in earlier times as wanderers without a country before 1948. I think politically, with regard to the Israel issue, I think Schindler today would have been a member of J Street. He would have favored Jewish charitable organizations that support the left in Israel today, like the New Israel Fund, for example. I think that's very definitely where he would stand, although he was always a strong, very strong Zionist, but a Zionist who believed that Israel should not dictate to American Jewry or to diaspora Jewry, that diaspora Jewry should have its say. What is so remarkable, and I devoted an entire chapter to it in the book, is his relationship with Menachem Begin. When Begin was elected in 1977, American jury was aghast. Here was an ex-terrorist who was now the prime minister of Israel. And the remarkable thing is that the liberal Schindler and the conservative Begin established a very profound relationship together, a personal relationship, which lasted until the end of their lives. Why was that the case? Because for them, being a Jew was more important than being an Israeli or an American. That's why it chose as the title of the book, Above All, We Are Jews, which is a quotation from Schindler, but which could as well have been spoken by Menachem Begin. So although they had very different views, they remained close. Schindler, when he became head of the President's Conference, the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, and thus the spokesman for virtually all of American Jewry, he made it a point of stressing that American Jews should not be simply echoes of Israeli policy, and that and there were some that were serious issues between them. For example, over the Vietnam War, where as a liberal he was very much opposed to that war, whereas Israel had a reason to believe that it was in its interest for the Americans to carry on the war in Vietnam. Similar situation developed later with regard to South Africa, where, again, there was a difference between liberal American Jewish opinion and the Israeli need to have an ally on the African continent. So there were these problems that arose, and that Schindler was able to manage them in a remarkable way. Another issue was a question, what kind of a relationship should Reform Jews have to Orthodox Jews? What bothered him greatly was when Reform Jews were willing to sacrifice their principles lest Orthodox Jews object. And so he did not want Reform to become, as he put it, a tinsel imitation of Orthodoxy. He said that a few times. He wanted Reform Judaism to be strong, independent, and self-confident.
Yeah, the chapters that you're talking about, especially the Israel chapter, is absolutely fascinating because you do talk about so many things that just never made it out into the world. I think it was in that chapter you talk about some correspondence that has never been seen or really not publicized, but the whole process with him and Begin and Sadat in I think it was in 78 February. The challenges of becoming the spokesperson for the Conference of Presidents, that story about that analysis there, also very fascinating. And also fascinating, and some of my colleagues and lay leaders who lived through this, some of the internal conflicts, struggles, disagreements, agreements, push-pull with ARTSA, the Reform Zionist organizations, Rabbi Hirsch, blessed memory, and how he was able to, what the right word is, not maneuver, but perhaps maneuver, but always try to get some sense of vision. His idea of a visionary, even though there are things, as you mentioned before, that he may have been struggling with, was really, I think, one of the secrets of the success of the movement during his tenure. He stood before a group of people at a biennial and said, "This is my vision. This is where we want to go. I invite you to come with me. We will have disagreements, but as you said in the title, but we're all Jews. We're always moving forward." Where do you think he would be now? Speaking of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, with and the birth of the outreach program with his decision to ordain students who are involved with spouses, partners who are not Jewish? I know it's speculative, but
I think he would say if there were a sufficient number of qualified candidates for the Reform rabbinate in the United States, it would be desirable to limit admission to individuals who were not in an interfaith marriage, because he believed that such in-marriages were more likely to produce a progeny who would be active Jews. However, given our present situation, where there is a dearth of qualified candidates for the rabbinate, and more congregations that are having difficulty finding rabbis, I think Schindler would have said in this case, as he said with regard to Christian members of a synagogue choir when no Jews were available, he would have said, under these circumstances, the decision is perhaps necessary. I'm not sure he would have been enthusiastic about it, but Schindler was also a pragmatist. He was not an ideologue, and I think it would have been his pragmatism in this case that would have made him say, under these circumstances, perhaps that's also a matter of what we need to do to deal with the situation. It's similar in a way to his feeling about outreach, that under these circumstances, we don't have the power to put an end to interfaith marriages. We should therefore try to deal with the situation that is at hand and make the best of it through programs of outreach, classes in Judaism for the non-Jewish partner, and welcoming of such individuals in the hope that they would ever more associate themselves with the Jewish community and assume a Jewish identity.
Before we run out of time, I have to ask you to just talk a little bit about, because you allude to it during the book, and then towards the end, his relationship with Rhea and his own family.
Well, Alexander Schindler, first pulpit, and really his only pulpit, was in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he was the assistant of Rabbi Klein, and where he met a young woman, a college graduate by the name of Rhea Rosenblum. They fell in love, and Rhea became a Rebbitzin. She did not have an active career of her own, but as was the case in those days, she devoted herself to the career of her husband. She taught women to light the candles. She, in other ways, played a role in the sisterhood, did all those things that a rabbi's wife did in those days. And she gave birth to 5 children, which is no small matter. And she accompanied him frequently on his trips. She was his critic, as I think a rabbi's wife or husband today should be. And I think theirs was a very much of a loving, close, and mutually assisting in various ways each other.
Yeah, I'm glad you wrote about it, because they were, in many ways, a power couple.
Oh, yes.
And my recollection with Rhea was no shrinking violet. This is a very, very dynamic, self-assured, brilliant.
She is still very dynamic. I had the pleasure of interviewing her for the book at the place where she lives in the Berkshires. And she's still very much with it.
Well, Dr. Meyer, thank you very, very much for this conversation, and equally for this gift that you've given us in the book. And I wish you much success with it. And I hope many of you who are listening or watching who would like a glimpse into the most powerful moments in the Reform movement in the 20th century, this is a book that will enlighten you, teach you, and I also think very much will inspire you.
I hope so. Thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Just stay safe, stay healthy, stay warm out there in Cincinnati.
Absolutely.
As well. To all of you, many, many thanks for joining us on today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. If you'd like to connect with us, please feel free to email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. Check out the website and also the Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page. If you'd like to help support the work that we do, again, on the website, there's a conveniently located donate button. Just click on it and just follow the prompts. And if you or your organization would like to sponsor a series of these podcasts, again, just email me. We'll take it from there. Seekers of Meaning is produced at the Broadcast Center of Lubetkin Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And a huge shout out to our genius producer, Steve Lubetkin. Thank you again for joining us. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address, and until we see each other again on the next Seekers of Meaning, please stay safe, take care of yourself, and most of all, be kind to one another. Shalom.
Shalom.